Thank you for inviting me to speak about visible learning there in Croatia. And I only wish one day that I can be there in person in your wonderful, lovely country. I've been trying to ask the question about what works for many, many years, and it always stunned me that everybody I met in education could tell me exactly how we need to run our classrooms and our schools to improve students' learning. But they all differ. Everybody has answers, parents, policymakers, teachers, school leaders. Why do we have a profession where it seems that there is evidence for everything? And so I started looking at how to accumulate evidence to look at this question. And when I started my career, this notion of meta-analysis came along. And all it is collecting many, many articles that are written by people here in Australia, where I live, where you live in Croatia, in America, in Shanghai. And a meta-analyst gets all those articles from the different people and asks two questions. First, how big is the effect? I'm going to introduce reciprocal teaching. I'm going to introduce a new policy in a school. Is the effect small, zero, small, medium, large? Is it positive or is it negative? And a meta-analyst answers that question. How big is the effect? The second thing, they say, well, okay, the overall effect of this policy is, let's say it's medium. Is that the same in Croatia and in Melbourne? Is it the same in high school and in elementary school? Is it the same in maths and music? And they're called moderators. And we continue to look to them. I'll give you an answer. They're incredibly difficult to find. What works best for 5-year-olds to 15-year-olds in maths and music in Australia and in Croatia. That doesn't mean to say your kids aren't unique. Of course they are. But you've got to stop saying, my class is different. My school is different. Actually, they're not. What matters is how you implement those policies with your students. It's you. That's the more unique part. And so I wrote a book in 2008 called Visible Learning, where I pulled together about 800 of those meta-analyses. And earlier this year, I released an update to it, now almost tripling that number to 2,100 meta-analyses. And when I look at all the effects across all 2,500 meta-analyses, 160,000 studies, about 300 million students, you can see there's not many things we do to students that are below zero, the red zone. So it makes sense that everybody can argue correctly. They have evidence to improve, they can improve learning, because virtually everybody can. It doesn't matter what you do, we can improve students' learning. What my interest is to change the question from what works to what works best. And I want to know, what are the underlying themes? What are the underlying influences for those teachers, those schools, and those students in that blue zone compared to those in the yellow zone? And I ask you, where are you? Are you in the blue zone or are you in the yellow zone? Now, I get a criticism. Oh, but wait a moment. I haven't got the time. You don't understand that here in Croatia, we have a curriculum that's huge. We have assessment. We have all these kind of pressures on us. And my answer to you is, well, how come there's a teacher in your school who is in that blue zone, and down the corridor, there is a teacher in the yellow zone, and they have the same kind of kids, the same leadership, the same finances, the same testing, the same curriculum. The variability within schools is our issue, and we need to face up to that. And the visible learning story is this simple. Do you have the courage to reliably identify those teachers in the blue zone, form a coalition of success around them, and invite those from the yellow zone to join? The biggest problem in education is courage. It is so much easier to talk about the kids, about the curriculum, about the assessment, about the resources, about structures of schools. sorry, the biggest influence are the teachers. Now, let me be blunt. And the reason that I keep working in this area is because I see so much success. Look at it. Well over 50% of the teachers throughout the world, maybe 60%, are already in that blue zone where their students are gaining more than a year's growth for a year's input. We are surrounded by excellence. And I know I'm speaking to you today that there's many of you that are in that blue zone now. Identifying that, esteeming that, capturing that, and then inviting those who are in that yellow zone to join is what the visible learning story is about. We have an evidence base. It's gone are the days where we could say, you have the autonomy to do what you like. If you're in the yellow zone, you do not have that autonomy at all, because there is an evidence base of what puts people into that blue zone above that 0.4 average. And I've been looking at it from what the school brings, the students, the teachers, the learning, the curricula, the parents, and so on. And what I want to do in the session I have with you today is to raise 4 big points, 4 major themes that come out of all that research, 300 million kids, that identifies and discriminates between those in the blue zone compared to those in the yellow zone. Okay, let's go to the first one. Climate first, learning second, and achievement third. So often we start the other way around and we talk about high achievement and good schools are high achieving schools. Well, not necessarily. If you take students who are already above the average and you don't add a year's growth, those kids in those schools are cruising, and that's not desirable. And there are many schools throughout Croatia where kids start well below the average, where they're gaining more than a year's growth for a year's input, and that should be esteemed. So I want to start the other way around. I want to look at the climate of the school, because that's what sets the foundation to then talk about the learning and the learning strategies and how we teach students the process of learning, which ultimately leads to progression towards achievement. Let me be specific. I want to foster a learning and culture. I do want to foster social and emotional skills, and I do want to foster high expectations for students. I use the Jenkins curve, and I invite you to use this. It's simple. Go in to each class, each grade in your school, randomly choose 4 or 5 students and ask them, do you want to come to learn what your teachers are teaching? And you can see 95% of 5-year-olds say yes. But at the end of elementary school, the start of high school, at best, 4 out of 10 say yes. Not good enough. You need to know whether your school is an inviting place. You need to know whether you can beat that Jenkins curve, because if you're not even in the game. And then I go more specifically. I look at the PISA study with 26 million students. 40% of students argue that their teacher does not show an interest in my learning. And notice those words, in my learning. And 40% say that teachers do not continue teaching us until we understand it. I want you to stand in the shoes of your students and see what your class looks like, because that's the climate that makes the difference. Now, there's lots of work, and I use the thermometers there, and you can see very high effect sizes from teacher-student relationships. They are critical, as is developing student-to-student relationships. But I want to ask why? Because I'm arguing they're a means to an end. Building those relationships is primarily because in those safe and high-trust classrooms, it is okay to take risks. It is okay not to know. It's okay to take on challenges. It's okay to make mistakes. And I want to come into your classroom and ask your students, what happens when you make a mistake in this classroom? And if they say they ask the teacher, nah, watch them. They don't. By age 8, many of the students who make mistakes learn, don't make a comment. It's about me. I'm not good enough. That is not. Learning is about what you don't know, because no child comes to a school in Croatia to learn that which they do know. It's what they don't know. So we need to see whether our classrooms are places where we can take risks. And high expectations. Look, teachers who have high expectations tend to have it for all their students. And teachers with low expectations tend to have it for all their students. And you can see the size of those effects are huge. And then there's the student expectations, which are even higher. And you can see there, dramatic. Students think if they can get a C, they're doing a good job because that's their expectation. Your job is to mess that up. Your job is to get the student to believe that they can go on and make a B, which means they need you and you can make a difference. But if you keep reinforcing that they're C students, that's where they'll stay. But come back to the teachers. My colleague, Christine Ruby Davies, who does a lot of this work, she goes into classrooms. And this is only 4. We have an article we published earlier this year with 40 differences. And the point I'm making is because of how the teacher is thinking about their expectations, you can see dramatic differences in the climate and what the experiences the students have in those classrooms. Huge differences. Differentiation for low expectation teachers means different activities for different groups of students. A disaster. Differentiation for high expectation teachers means every student I want to get to the success criteria, but I'm going to allow different times and different ways to get there. Quite a different notion of what we mean. So understanding, school leaders, understanding your teacher's expectations are pretty critical. And if they're not high expectations, they're not going to make a difference to many of your students. Aim high, aim +1, aim to move the students above and beyond where they are at the moment. And that are the keys to classroom climate. The second is this notion that students should drive their own learning. This is not the same as students in control of their learning. They're not. Students don't know what they don't know. And when we give students choices and we give students control, they tend to do, like we do, they tend to do that which they already can do because they don't know what they don't know. And so the notion we have instead is we want students to drive their own learning. And if you want to see it in action, go into a class of 4 or 5-year-olds. They're constantly doing it. By age 8, many of them have learned that classrooms are places you come to, hopefully well prepared, sit up straight and watch the teacher work. That's not what we want. These are the key notions about driving learning. Having a conversation about what we mean by learning, looking at the cognitive complexity of what we're teaching, the content, and then the problem posing. Teaching the learning strategies, and that leads to self-driving learners. I think if I spent time with you now and asked you, what is your theory of teaching? Everybody in the room would speak for hours, and that is a wonderful thing. It's just so great when teachers talk about their theory of learning. And yeah, we differ a lot, but we do have a very strong theory. And now I'm going to ask you to talk about your theory of learning. Yeah. Often it's silence. Often we talk about how we learn. And many of us, even as adults, even as teachers, when we talk about how we learn, struggle with the language of learning. I call my work visible learning, not because it's visible. It's not. That's the problem. I call it visible learning because I want to make the learning more visible. I want to hear students thinking aloud. I want to hear a teacher thinking aloud. We have 20,000 hours of classroom transcripts. And when we look through them for examples of when a teacher thought aloud, or when they ask a student to think aloud when they're solving a problem, in 20,000 hours, we found 0. What would it be in your classroom? Now, your students, they kind of don't care about how you teach. They know that every teacher is going to be different. But they fundamentally care about how you learn. How did you get that? That student got it. How did they get it? They want to know. They want to hear it. And as I commented, even as adults, we struggle to talk about how we learn. And often students and us talk about how we learn, and it's actually not how we learn. Many of us are very good at going down a path in our thinking, and we're very good at error management. We see it's wrong, we go back over and we go over here and get it right. And all the students say, wow, that's impressive. And when we tell them, we forget the error management part and we just go straight to the answer. Our argument is we should have a theory of learning. Now, here's our theory of learning. We look at the surface, the knowledge, the facts, the content, the knowing that. We look at the deep learning, the knowing how. How did you do that? And we look at the transfer. Can you take what you've learned about the content and about the deeper learning and transfer it? We also make the distinction between when you first are exposed to ideas compared to when you consolidate them. Because we are a little brain. Most of us can only remember and recall 4 to 6 things in our brain at once. So we have to overlearn certain things as that allows us to go into deep learning. Imagine you had a child who was struggling with what 9 times 6 is and they're working it out. All their working memory is on 9 lots of 6. Whereas this student, who has consolidated 9 6s to 54, they're using that 54 in a problem. All their memory is on that problem. I'm not sure we're as good at teaching consolidation as we think we are. And when we look at the learning strategies, you can see that they differed quite dramatically depending on which part of the learning cycle. Now, when we look at across the 400 different teaching methods we've identified, 95% of them are random. They're all over the place. They don't help the student at all understand what strategies are best to apply when. And so our argument is we as teachers need to be more specific that this lesson, this part of the lesson, this assignment, this assessment is about the content that I want you to know, the processes, the facts. And this assignment and this lesson is going to be about the deeper. And I need both. It's not either or, it's when. You can't problem solve until you've got facts. Sometimes when you problem solve first, you can work out what facts you don't have and then go back and teach it. And you can see there that when you're first acquiring things, have your students got the skills of outlining and summarizing? If they don't, it's just incoming information. And many of them, after 1 or 2 minutes, turn off, can't cope. So go into your class, tell your students you're going to talk to them for 10 minutes and you want them to take notes. Give them time to summarize and organize it and have a look at how they go about building that coat hanger to hang all the ideas on. It's a pretty powerful learning strategy. And then look at consolidation. This is where memorization, 0.96. Memorization at the knowing that acquiring, 0.03. That's not the time. There's a right time for memorization. Spacing practice out, giving students 4 or 5 opportunities to learn something over days, not in the same day, but over days, has a huge effect. And then you can see going on to deeper, relating the ideas, seeking clarity. And this is where student voice, knowing how consolidation, student verbalization, student explanations, students thinking about it, that's the time for it. Not back at the knowing that stage. Has a 0 to negative effect, students talking aloud. That's your time. This is their time. Our argument is we need to be a lot more systematic about that. And that leaves us to the characteristics of self-driving students. Self-driving students know their level of understanding. I can come into your class and ask your student, what is it that you know at the moment? What is it you're aiming for? What is it you're going to have to work on from where you are to where you want to be? They know where they're going. And they have the confidence because you've given them the safety. You've taught them the confidence that they can take on a challenge. It's okay not to succeed the first or the second time. They're good at selecting tools to know, for example, which learning strategies to use that are most optimal. They know how to seek and use feedback. They see errors, not as embarrassments, but as opportunities to learn. They can evaluate their progress and they can recognize their learning and can work and probably the best exit ticket from any class is, can they teach other students? And we talk about this as students who can drive their own learning. And we recently published an illustrated guide to visible learning, picking out the signature practices that lead to self-driving students, making sure there's clarity. And by that, I mean you telling the students what success looks like, but the key is, do the students understand the concept of success? They wouldn't play their video games if they didn't know what success looks like. They wouldn't play their sports if they didn't know what success looks like. Too often, in many classrooms, success is just doing the work, handing it in, kind of finishing it. That is not clarity. We talked about the phases of learning. We talked about deliberately teaching and sometimes overlearning, consolidating. The power of feedback. Effective feedback is that feedback which is heard, understood, and actioned. And then I want to come to this notion of evaluative thinking. And all those things come together with very, very powerful effects. And you can see almost double the rate of learning. The third is this notion of impact. My whole theme is, do you know your impact? And that begs, what do you mean by impact? And I hope in your school you have a very clear notion and shared notion of what you mean by impact. And if it's doing well on the tests, it's a pretty boring school. But I'm not averse to that. These are my ones. I'm deeply clear that the students have motivated. They have a thrill to come to this class because it's safe to learn and it feels inviting. They have to feel they belong, no matter what their prior ability. We have to teach them the confidence to take on challenges and respect for self and others. And then I care about whether they know the optimal strategies of learning. And then the progress towards that high achievement, which is the outcome of this whole process. And we look at dashboards as we work with schools that look right across those major notions of impact. Now, let me be blunt. So often in education, we have professional learning about how to do a new teaching method, a new resource, a new curriculum. And one of the big themes that comes out of my work is it's less about what you do that matters, but how you think about what you do. And we spend a lot of time looking at how teachers think about their impact. And you can see for teachers, we have 10. Actually, we have one repeated 10 times. When you walk into a class, I want you to say, my job here today is to evaluate my impact, and all good things follow. Obviously, yes, you're going to have to know what you mean by impact, and we've talked about that. I want to listen to the students. I want to have the students hear me listening to them, standing in their shoes to understand how they are solving problems or not, their concept of what it means to be successful and their progress. I want to see any assessment as feedback to me about what I did well and what I didn't do well. I want to have collaboration with my peers and my other teachers in the schools about my notions of progress and impact. I fundamentally want you to believe that you are a change agent. You're not a guide on the side. You are a change agent. Your job is to change the students' learning. And I want you to deliberately say you're doing that because, as you saw, we have an incredible number of teachers who are excellent at being change agents. And they too strive for challenge. I want to give and help the students understand the feedback I give them. We know, going back to our 20,000 hours of classroom observations, that you talk, on average, 89% of the class time. It's a bit much. I want to have more students thinking aloud about their work, talking to each other about their progress, their selection of learning tools, how well they're going. I want as much dialogue as I want monologue. I want to explicitly inform the students what success looks like. One of the easiest things to start with, working out good success criteria and then checking, do the students understand? Perhaps giving them a worked example of what success looks like, giving them an A, a B, and a C, and saying, this is what an A looks like. This is what you should be aiming for, students. If you're a D student, maybe you should aim for a C or a B, and then progress towards the A. I want you to deliberately worry about building relationships and trust so that it's okay for errors to be welcomed in this class. And I do want that relentless focus on learning. And as we've been looking at the mind frames, the way teachers think, the way school leaders think, the way parents and students and so on think, it comes back to this notion of evaluative thinking, how we evaluate our evidence about our impact. And it's the 3 impact questions. What did I teach well today? And what did I not teach well? Who did I make an impact on? And who did I not make an impact on? And how big was that impact I had? And you can see that point 3 there. I'm also looking at the evidence I'm wrong, what I didn't succeed in, who I didn't succeed with, who I didn't make progress with, because that's the hallmark of great educators. They're looking for that negative evidence and they act on it. They're looking for that evidence about their impact and they act on it. And then we can work and look at the nature of our evidence, how we make that judgment, from our noticing, from our assessments, from the assignments we give students, from our walking around the room, from our test scores. There are many ways that we can bring to evidence. And we also want to seek other people's perspective. And that brings me to my 4th point, collective responsibility. Croatia, we can't solve this one teacher at a time. We can't solve this one school at a time. It needs to be a collective effort because it's one of the highest impacts. When teachers work together, discussing their impact, evaluating their impact, you can see it increases the rate of learning by a factor of 4 or 5, and the students are not even in the room. Bringing along, let's say, piece of a student's work today and 3 months later, and having a discussion about whether that's 3 months' growth. Now, please don't do that if there's not high trust in the staff room, because it's a pretty strong question. But looking at the nature of our students and their progress collectively and building that up makes a difference. And remembering, school leaders, those teachers that are already in the blue zone, I want you to privilege their voice. I want you to privilege their thinking because they talk about their impact and how they can improve it. Many of the teachers in the blue zone want to talk about the students and why they're no good, and why they can't do things, and why the curriculum's too hard or the tests are too wrong. No, it's thinking about our impact that makes the difference. Because when you focus on collective efficacy, you privilege and you welcome and you support teachers with high expectations. You discuss the impact of teaching practices much more than you discuss the teaching practices. You're aware of each other's impact. You learn to moderate what an A and a B and a C is collectively. And you agree that in this school, in this grade, in this subject, this is what a year's growth looks like. So my message today is 4-fold. And yes, it does come from a lot of data, from a lot of meta-analysis and a lot of evidence. But I put it to you that in starting our discussions, I want much more discussion about how we think. Yes, what we do matters, but how we think about what we do. Yes, having discussions about how we teach, yeah, that matters. But I also want discussions about how do we learn and how do we want our students to learn. And I want to see much more evidence looking at the climate of our classrooms, our focus on learning, on our progress. I want us to aim, as our purposes of schools across Croatia, is to teach our students to drive their own learning. And I want to do it collectively. So thank you for inviting me here today to your session. And as I said at the beginning, I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you.